everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll just wait until exactly noon. Wait till the clock changes. I do like to start classes on time as well as lectures on time, just to respect everyone's time. Beautiful day for a beautiful conversation. For those of you who joined us last week for the mayoral candidate debate, it was super interesting to see and hear people's viewpoints with regards to climate change and our city, and it was quite wonderful. Today we are super pleased that we can have Ginger Gibson and Jessica Vandenberg talking to us with regards to engineering community benefits and how do we consider those. So we're going to start, we're starting right now, we're recording. I'm going to be moderating your discussion. My name is Leanne Lester. I'm an associate professor in engineering and chemical materials engineering. I do risk management stuff. And I will be moderating the discussion. We've got some questions that I think are going to be some common questions that we'll start with, and then we'll open it up to discussions, questions from participants. And we're going to choose and cluster questions to support Jessica and Ginger's conversation. So if we could have the land acknowledgement, please, Allison, it'd be wonderful. If we could start with this acknowledgement that the University of Alberta, we respectfully acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, Métis Nation Zone 4, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. I also want to point out that we are all treaty people, and we are all relations, not only with the land, but with each other, and now and also future generations. So with that in mind, may we go forward in a good way with regards to our conversation with Ginger and Jessica, and support this ongoing conversation. We're showing here the sweetgrass bear. For those of you who have been able to be on campus, this is a wonderful reminder of the land, our connection to the land, and the connection to each other. So we'll also put in the chat, nativeland.ca. So if you're not necessarily joining us from Treaty 6 land, you can find out where you are in the map. And then again, recognize your connections not only to the land, but the peoples who have come before us. So this talk is part of a broader Sustainability Council lecture series. And during this academic year, as Allison showed the carousel, we host several interdisciplinary scholars, professionals, and activists who engage with sustainability, climate change, and environment concepts, research, and work in the community. And these lectures are usually bi-weekly throughout the academic year. And just a note for those of you who could not be with us today, we are recording this. We will publish it on our YouTube channel in a few weeks. You will not appear in the video, so you don't have to worry about that. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce you to our speakers for today. We have two fantastic people who are going to support a really wonderful discussion. First is Jessica Vandenberg, PN, MSc. She's got quite diverse experience in oil sands, mining, regulatory infrastructure, and consulting industries. She holds a BSc in chemical engineering, computer process control, co-op, and an MSc in chemical and mining engineering, both from the University of Alberta. Her career has taken her to communities large and small around the nation, and she's sat on many boards and councils with stakeholders such as federal, provincial, municipal governments, and with First Nations, Métis settlements, Métis nations, as well as academic institutions and private industry. So she's kind of spanned them all in terms of different sort of organizational structures and governance structures. As a mother of two and an Indigenous female engineer, she's passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion, along with truth and reconciliation and what that means. She's currently the Assistant Dean, Engineering Community and Culture, and Industrial Professor of Indigenous Engineering for University of Alberta, Faculty of Engineering, where she oversees a wide portfolio that contributes to the development of well-rounded and ethically minded engineering students who will ultimately build strong and vibrant communities within Canada. So yeah, she's there, she's doing it. Ginger Gibson, also someone who's there and doing it, is Dr. Ginger Gibson, is a director of Firelight Group, which is an Indigenous-owned research and consulting firm. Firelight supports more than 250 Indigenous communities across the country, including in environmental assessment and regulatory reviews, social health, cultural and economic impact assessment, risk assessment, and communication. She has spent 25 years working in Canada, Australia, and Latin America with communities on issues ranging from public participation, risk communication, negotiation, and management of large-scale extractive projects. Whew. She has authored expert witness reports for judicial reviews in Ontario and British Columbia on cultural heritage, impact and benefit agreements, and harvesting loss. She serves as a negotiator of impact and benefit agreements and has negotiated agreements with many of the major and minor companies across the country. She is co-author of IBA Community Toolkit for negotiation of impact and benefit agreements. She was a Trudeau Scholar, and she completed her PhD in mining engineering at the University of British Columbia and is now an adjunct professor there. So super amazing person, both super amazing people. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to first to Jessica to talk about sustainability and what it means to her and her work. So please, Jessica.
All right, thank you for that, and thank you for the honor of coming in and chatting with you folks today. I'm also joining from the traditional territory Treaty 6 in Métis Nation Zone number 4 here in Edmonton, Alberta. So thanks again for having me. I'm going to share a few slides just to keep my thoughts focused around sustainability and what that means to me. And so I'm going to share with you again an engineering perspective, because I'm of course a professional engineer. And as we go through our journey to become a professional engineer, we do have to be both technically trained but also ethically minded. And so that pillar of ethics is just so important. And so when we think about ethics and we think about our obligations when we sign off on that code of ethics, it is to work in the public interest, which is the greater good, to keep in mind and be the voice for those not at the table in terms of both people, but also in terms of environment. When I think about sustainability, what comes to mind are a couple of the Indigenous teachings that I've had over the years from elders and knowledge keepers. The first one is actually the 7 generations teaching, that we all walk with a bundle that has been passed to us from the 7 generations prior to us. And so that bundle might be heavy, it might be light, it might be good teachings, it might be things that we need to take responsibility for because those people have passed those bundles on to us. And so we exist in a finite small amount of time in the great length of the history of the world and all, but in our decisions, we also need to think about the 7 generations after. So when I think about sustainability, I really think about this teaching because it's not just me thinking in the moment about me. It's me thinking about what has been passed to me in this bundle from the previous 7 generations that I need to be responsible while I'm here, but also thinking ahead to the next 7 generations and what I'm trying to set up for them in order for them to be successful, in order for them to have the resources that they need to make sure that their needs and wants are met as well for whatever the world might look like coming after me. The other teaching that really resonates with me when it comes to thinking about sustainability is, as Leanne acknowledged in her land acknowledgement, this idea of we are all relations, this idea that's really founded in the Cree teaching of Wokotowin. And so what was taught to me about Wokotowin was very much that we're all interconnected, that we are all weaved together, but not just people to people, but it's us with our families, it's us with our community, it's us with our nations, it's us with our natural environment, that land spirit and water spirit and insect kingdom and mineral nation, they're all our relations. And we all have a responsibility in order to respectfully treat those relationships and keep in mind how to make sure that those are sustainable as well. But we also have this connection with the spirit world as well. I believe that the ancestors walk with me and that one day I'll walk with the next 7 generations. And so it's this interconnected relationship as well as the teaching of the 7 generations that really come to mind when I think about sustainability. And so when I think about how I would apply that to engineering projects, it's again, very much around risk management. It's around thinking ahead, thinking through impact, not just to people, but to those who aren't at the table, those who we need to represent. And sometimes that's water spirit, and sometimes that is the ecosystems and the plants that are there. And sometimes it's communities that are impacted by the location of where we're putting our engineering projects. And sometimes it's thinking ahead, thinking that maybe this is something that won't affect communities immediately, but in the next 3 generations. And I think through some of the engineering examples where that attitude and that teaching wasn't quite incorporated. And a good example is Giant Mine in the Northwest Territories, where they did a major excavation and it's still decades later and we're still trying to figure out the reclamation for that. But if the thought process had gone into the project planning of that, the thought process had gone on to consider land and consider environment, consider water impact and community impact, that project might have been done in a different way. And so for me, sustainability is really grounded in all of those things, that we have an obligation to be the voice for those that are impacted by our engineering projects and decisions, but don't always have a seat at the table. And in order to do that, we need to have a really good understanding of a wide variety of demographics amongst people, but also amongst the environment and the ecosystems that we are part of. And so we really need to act as those stewards and those guardians, really acting in that way. And that's part of very much my attitude when I think about engineering projects or research or program development, thinking through how can we really act as those stewards. So that's what I wanted to share in short around my thoughts on sustainability. So I'll hand it back to you, Leanne.
Thank you, Jessica, for that fantastic introduction to yourself. Ginger, so if you could just talk about what do you do and how sustainability means to you, what it means to you in your work.
I certainly will, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Ginger Gibson, I'm really pleased to join you here in conversation from Treaty 6 and the Métis Zone 4 in our Edmonton office. Thank you, Leanne, for the introduction, and wonderful to see you, Jessica, and be in conversation with you. It's a real pleasure. I feel really grateful to be able to have a conversation with my learned colleagues. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm a settler in Treaty 6, and I've been here much of my life. I've been in other jurisdictions as well. And today I'm hoping to share with you a little bit about my own journey. For me, sustainability really means implementing the treaty and implementing the many treaties that we hold across the country. So I'm kind of an odd duck. I have a PhD in mining engineering, but I'm not an engineer. Previous to that, my undergraduate learning was actually at the University of Alberta and my master's. So I have 2 degrees from the university and then a PhD from UBC. I've always been drawn to and fascinated by the extractive industries. And I'm really have been coming to the grips my entire career with the social and cultural implications of these industries on land and on communities. And so I've really dedicated my career and my thinking to really understanding how to hold up the other half of the treaties. So what are settler responsibilities to implement treaty? What are our obligations that flow from them? In 2010, I founded a research firm with my colleagues. So it's an Indigenous owned firm. 76% of our firm is held by and owned by Indigenous people. I changed numbers because it just changed. We just had part of our business purchased by a new board member, Pamela Perot, who I'm super happy to have join us. But there's 3 Indigenous owners and 2 non-Indigenous, and that's I guess a testament to the connection that settlers have to Indigenous people, is that we're implementing and building a firm that works only for Indigenous communities across Canada. So as Leanne said, we serve Indigenous communities across Canada on their research issues. So whether it's on for example, Jessica mentioned Giant Mine, or whether it's on other contaminated sites or on traditional use research. So We made the commitment many years ago to serve only Indigenous governments, and I think that's a bit of a different commitment than many research firms out there. We decided early on that we had that there's plenty of space that's taken up and is provided, many services provided for government and industry, and that the commitment could be made to serve only Indigenous communities. A bit of an advertisement about what we do. We live up to our treaty responsibilities through the services we provide. As I said, we only work for Indigenous communities. I'll talk about more about this later, but we support communities in a whole range of areas. We hire students from the University of Alberta. And in fact, one of our current co-op placements is here today, Ayla Blackburn. And I'm pleased to have her here and to be one of our co-op placements from engineering. We've had many from engineering before, so please do. And any areas, actually, we've had anthropology, sociology, GIS and mapping, lots of different careers that are out there for students to think about how to implement and live up to our treaty responsibilities. For me, Leanne, the question is, what does sustainability mean to you? It's about educating the current generation about our treaty responsibilities. So I know that Jessica is placing her mind in the 7 generations, and I do that as well, but I also try to think about who it is and how they, who it is that's in university at the moment and how we are educating about them, about the realities in communities across the country. When I tried to think about this really clearly, I was brought back to an experience I had this June. So I was very fortunate this June to be in a Trudeau Foundation session in which Dr. Chief Wilton Littlechild came to dinner and talked to us about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has calls to action. And he broke it down in such a beautiful way for us. So I was really grateful to him because he said, don't be intimidated by the TRC. There's lots of recommendations. And so for me, when I think about sustainability, I looked at all of the recommendations and I was overwhelmed. And he said, don't be overwhelmed. Turn and look at them all. We put something out there for everyone. Turn and look at those and find what works for you. Find what's interesting for you. Find what you can put your career behind. So I have put my career behind this one, number 92. I'm not going to read it all, but I've dedicated my career to working on business and reconciliation. So it says, we call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and cooperational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. I've dedicated my career and will continue to work on this. And that's why I'm so grateful in some ways to, sorry, I didn't even move the screen down, did I? There's the services. I apologize. I was looking at a different screen. There's our services. Bit of a Zoom fail for me today. And here's the call to action. So this call to action is the one that I really think resonates for me and is how I try to implement my journey towards understanding our duties in the treaty as settlers. And I put up a picture of one of the toolkits, a toolkit that I wrote, because in that toolkit, I think we really are able to look at how to hold companies down, either as engineers or as practitioners in this field, how to hold companies down to the commitments that are in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So you can make, there's legislation that we're passing on the United Nations Declaration that calls for the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous people when projects are operating on their land. But when it comes to actually implementing these kinds of big pieces, legislation or the TRC, a contractual agreement between a company and Indigenous people takes all of those rights and pulls them down into a contract. That's a lot of what I do, is pulling these things down into contracts. So I hope, Leanne, that helps you to understand kind of the business that Firelight does. And I'm just super eager to get into a conversation with Jessica now.
Thank you for that introduction, Ginger. Yes, it does seem overwhelming. I mean, when I talk to students, they feel this existential dread of, oh my gosh, climate change and and truth and reconciliation issues and COVID, like it's often very overwhelming, and we will often get contradictory messages about what should we do and how do we do it, and it's even when we choose to work with companies, as an example, it's an interesting dynamic when you think about having to balance these competing demands like profitability and how do you work with an Indigenous community. The movement went towards ESG, environmental, social, and governance reporting, along with duty to consult. So there's, again, all these competing demands. So can you, Ginger, perhaps go first, describe about how you share your perspectives on these competing tensions and how you navigate them yourself? Besides, this overwhelmingness, it comes down to specific tensions in terms of your day-to-day work. So if you could just describe how you do that.
Sure. First of all, I hear that we're framing it as tensions, and I certainly see that tension there as in terms of corporate reporting. I think the reality is that it's required that companies address the social and cultural implications, address the treaties, and address the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. I think it's a fact, and should it be ignored? If governments ignore it, should it be ignored? It's to their own detriment, and it does impact their bottom line. I'll give you an example. In May of 2019, the caves at Yukon Gorge in Western Australia were destroyed. So those caves were over 40,000 years old. They were fundamental to the cultural well-being of the nation that is in that area, and that devastation to them was horrifying. They keep in mind this was done with full government consent. So the government had authorized the destruction of cultural heritage, even though they had been asked not to do so by the Indigenous people, to the point where the Indigenous people were were asking them to stop, sort of at the bulldozer moment. And the Rio Tinto did not. So Rio Tinto, with full knowledge of what they were doing, destroyed those 40,000-year-old caves. The government authorized it, right? It was fully within the view of the government that this was occurring, despite many discussions and reviews of it. Afterwards, the people were devastated. They were not able to give their free prior informed consent, and they went into shock. The company was blown into the media, and this is where 20 years ago, what happened then would not have happened. The two most senior people in Rio Tinto lost their jobs. So in the old days, you'd call it their heads were chopped off. They were chopped off, and they said, even though it was legal from legislative perspective, the government authorized this, these folks were had their heads chopped off. And so as a result, I think you see from that example that Rio Tinto is paying the price through at the most senior levels. They're paying the price and now having to reckon poorly at the moment with how to make amends for this kind of cultural devastation. So I hold up the standard when I think about the tension between corporate reporting and community engagement. I hold that up as an example now to say this should never happen again. We need to stop authorizing this kind of destruction. This year has taught us a lot about the destruction that can occur in communities. And so this is where I hold up the standard that is in place through the United Nations Declaration. Indigenous people ought to be able to give their free, that means they're not coerced, prior, that means it's done before the activity occurs, and informed. All of the information needs to be in place, and consent, meaning they can say no. And so I hold this up as the standard for consultation, that there ought to be consent given so that we can find the balance for profitability.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a absolutely horrible example of things going to go horribly wrong. But like you said, it wouldn't have happened whereby the senior executives' heads would have rolled, I would suggest even 3 or 5 years ago, right? Or even 2 years ago. It's been an interesting shift with regards to corporations facing consequences, right, in ways that they hadn't before. So Jessica, can you talk a bit about how your perspective with regards to these tensions and how you kind of navigate your way through them?
100%, and just to build off what Ginger has built on there, that I agree that when reading the calls to action, don't read them literally. There's a place for everybody in there, whether it's at an individual level, a leader level, or an influencer level. You can see yourself in those calls to action. And just as a note, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission isn't the only study that has calls to action. Like the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Commission report has 231 calls to action. There are many places that Indigenous peoples have been looking and asking for and crying for help. I have worked in the regulatory business. I've worked closely with federal and provincial governments. What really resonates from what Ginger has shared is that often industry will do what the regulatory or the government has assigned, which is very little. And so often when I talk with industry leaders, they'll say, well, we're going to do the industry standard. We're going to do the industry average. But what I always challenge back is like, why would you want to just be average amongst industry? Why wouldn't you not want to push there? Why wouldn't you not want to be the leader to put in place something that has more ethical value and has more meaning to especially Indigenous communities and community impact? Industry needs to drive where this can go and to do it in a good way. If you're doing the minimum, you are already doing more harm. If you've had a chance to study truth and reconciliation and really come face to face with the truth, then you know that oppressiveness is built into our federal systems. It's built into our legal systems and does not mean justice is being done. And because that's built into those systems, taking our direction from those bodies as to what is the minimum we should do sometimes isn't good enough. And industry really needs to drive pushing ahead and doing more. And it's one of those things that it's great to hear the Firelight Group is taking efforts to go above and beyond what's put there for just duty to consult, but really, really understanding and building those kinship relationships with communities to understand the need, doing proper consultation and engagement, but really thinking through impact, not just immediate profitability. And so that tension is there. And working for the regulator as well, I had a lot of conversations with even professional engineers at a personal level, where often they did have to walk away from companies because they just couldn't agree with the business decisions being made because they weren't necessarily ethical. And we see that in things like the commission that happened out in Quebec with SNC-Lavalin and the intricacies of the corruption and collusion that was not only within industry, but within government and within regulatory bodies and things like that, that it's sometimes the way things were done is not the way that they should be.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's, you've already mentioned a bit with regards to some of the decisions that people make with regards to their career path. So you both have made a career in sustainability that borders on environment, climate change, Indigenous communities, social impact, succession planning. How did you navigate into doing this kind of work? Jessica, do you want to start, please?
Sure, definitely. I mean, it's one of those things where my story starts in rural Alberta, small farming community, very little exposure to engineering and to the bigger world. But I was actually chatting with somebody this morning, the value of world travel and seeing and being in places that just open your eyes to so many different perspectives. And so I had a chance to travel growing up, and I made my way to the university and learned about the engineering profession and the broadness of it and found my way in it. But I quickly also learned that I was in the minority for a couple of different intersection points, one for being female gender, but also being an Indigenous person. And often I have been the only one in the rooms of that intersection point of diversity. And then wanting to encourage others to join the engineering profession. So being part in a volunteer way in a number of diversity organizations like Wisest or Discovery or the Alberta Women's Science Network and all these different organizations that were just kind of popping up when I was going through school, but are now a lot more established. And there's a lot of research behind how we need to do marketing different, how we need to change the impression of engineering. There's a million business case why diversity is important, and really breaking down a lot of stereotypes and barriers. especially because I know the capability exists within the minority groups. It's not that there isn't an affinity or an ability to do math and science. It's the culture is working against the person to be supported all the way through. And so for me, it was often working in a volunteer role or doing efforts on the side of my desk, but then taking the opportunities to make it part of my job duties. And now I have the fortune and privilege to work on behalf of the faculty, working in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion, and decolonization, and truth and reconciliation, amongst other things. So an ability to really influence and build that into our programs and teaching and research so that our student experience allows for the growth of students in those areas to feel supported as they continue their journey off to be professional engineers.
Yeah, fantastic discussion of your journey, right? And both inspiring and instructive, I would say. So Ginger, can you describe a bit about your journey and how you've kind of navigated your career path?
Sure. I actually had a summer trip as a child. I remember going to Grassy Narrows, and my mom and dad, who were quite eager to make sure that I understood our colonial history, took us there. And so Grassy Narrows, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the location of a nation whose land has been destroyed by the leaking of methyl mercury from barrels that were knowingly hidden in the land, and destroyed the fisheries of Grassy Narrows, of the community there. So corporate malfeasance, or whatever the big word is for that, it was knowingly done. And there's been many years of work taking care of and looking at the impacts of methyl mercury on communities, on that community in particular, and really reckoning with that social justice issue. So it hit me hard. I was only 11 at the time, and it woke me up to our relationship to the land, and it woke me up to our behavior as corporations, and the many knowing acts that companies have gone through and then impacted on communities. I kind of just followed that impulse of looking at it from a social justice perspective and thinking about my place in the effort to address that and make sure that there is change in the way that we operate on treaty lands. And I think of all of the extractives, I think of them as treaty mining companies, because all of the exploration and mining, all of the development projects are occurring within treaty lands, and they are enabled by our policies and our legislation. So ever since then, I've been thinking about it from my career, from the good undergraduate degree that I got from the University of Alberta, the master's that I also received there. And then I ended up for a little while in Latin America, working in communities that had had accidents that involved large scale mining accidents in the communities. And at that point, I mean, sometimes your career is influenced by the people you get the lucky chance to run into. And I ran into a fellow who, Dr. Marcelo Vega, and it was just luck that he said, "Why don't you do a PhD with me?" And I said he was mad because I was an anthropologist. And he said, that's not a good enough reason. And so I ended up doing, following the whimsy and the ideas of both, and having the encouragement of a very strong family, being able to pursue a career in engineering, not in engineering itself, but in a PhD in engineering. And I wanted to just close this piece, this comment, Leanne, by saying that I recognize something that Jessica just said, and I'm really happy about spaces where we can make it so Indigenous people are not alone, and are not the only ones who are told to stand up for and represent everybody as though they're representing everyone behind them. And I'm very proud of the firm that we run now, because of the fact that our leadership is primarily Indigenous, and those of us who are non-Indigenous, we're learning how to keep our mouths shut, and listen better and listen well, and then do as we're told. And I think it's time that we as treaty people sit back and stop being the bosses and start being the listeners. And so I wanted to just say I appreciate what Jessica said, because the words of my business partners resonate in me, and they're often instructing me to take a back seat, and I'm often happy to do so.
Yeah, which leads me to my question then of listen better, listen well, do as we're told. So you come with certain technical expertise. So when you work with community members, with nations, how do you balance that technical expertise with their own knowledge? You know, listen well, listen better, do as we're told. There's again, it's again, how do you do that? What does that look like? Tell me examples.
Well, I mean, ultimately it is that, right? It's listen and know when to listen. And I only offer a little bit. I offer a small part of the puzzle to address our relationships. And I offer technical and professional knowledge. And I know that it makes only a part of the picture. So let me give you an example. From a practical perspective, if I tried to organize a community meeting, it would be a gong show. No one would show up, and there wouldn't be coffee or tea, and I would probably be just speaking to myself. So from a very practical perspective, I don't have the skills or the relationships or the authority to engage and develop a consultation effort or to run a community meeting. But from a knowledge-based perspective, I know that I have seen countless times in my career that while I may offer some technical expertise, none of my knowledge can offer what's based in the land, what elders and knowledge holders know about the land. So when you're running a project, when you're developing as a proponent or a company, when you're proposing a particular project, there's absolutely no way that you can understand the land in which you're developing that project without consulting the knowledge holders. You can't understand where the animals are, what people know about that land, what they know about the water, unless you actually speak to the people whose rights will be impacted and who hold that land sacred. So I'm aware of that, and I'm aware that I only bring a small piece of the puzzle, and that there's a big puzzle that we assemble together.
Yeah, fair enough. Absolutely. Jessica, how do you do that balance, your expertise with community members' knowledge and how you approach it?
So very similar approach in that it's very much about listening and coming to the table with everyone there. It's a different attitude, I find, than what it was about 20 years ago, where engineers would come in and with a very type A personality and just take charge and just build something because that's what technically made sense. It's a different approach nowadays where you do the community consultation, you put a lot of time into planning, and you do consultation the way the community is used to. And Ginger's example was perfect. Community engagement for sure. Having worked for a number of different consultancy firms and have my own firm right now as well, I've seen a lot of community engagement fail because people will come in, okay, we sent an email out, we'll expect the members at this place, but then something will happen. There might be a community passing or people just don't read the email and then there's nobody there. And then they mark the box off as consultation done, when in actuality, no one was even there. But planning it with the community and doing it in the community way, you get the engagement there, you get the people there. There's a different approach to giving time to people and building the relationships before you need them. And that's always my biggest piece of advice, is build the relationships before you need them, but also put the time in to maintain them. That is just so important. I know I am fortunate to have gone and got an education, and fortunate to have traveled a lot of places and worked in a lot of worlds and been invited to a lot of rooms, a lot of chief and council rooms and government decision-making rooms and project rooms. And I've been fortunate to be able to watch and observe and take part in how do you actually listen and how do you actually gather and how do you build relationships. But a lot of us act as bridges because we can walk in many different worlds. And so we can walk in the industry world. Often with my consultancy firm, I sit as a facilitator, a mediator, a person just to act as that bridge to get the technical folks to talk in a simpler way and talk in a way that approaches community through their protocols. And then working with the community as well to say, okay, this is where the technical folks are coming from, but this is, this is how you speak up, and this is how you can work with them in order to ensure that your voice is heard and that they understand the context that you're building in, because a lot of things work very differently, even though it's assumed that they work the same. And land ownership is a perfect example. How it works on reserves and how it works on Métis settlements is very different than a municipality. Yet most people approach it the same as a municipality, and then unsuccessfully, of course. So definitely acting as a bridge, being active and listening and building those relationships before you need them are key to navigating that world.
Yeah, fair enough. So does your education and professional background influence like your relationships with community, like how you build them, how you work with them?
It does, for sure. Definitely, you go through university, you learn a lot about math and science and technical courses. But some of the biggest learnings I've had was being part of the Toastmasters group and being part of social groups where I needed to lead those social groups, or being the one to lead the ball team for a year and having to get people to respond to things and finding different ways to do that. It's all the in-between stuff that comes, as well as this really authentic approach I find works the best. If you're coming with a savior type complex, if you're coming with the solutions, if you talk over everybody in the room, or if you take people nodding their heads as agreement, but in actuality they're just acknowledging that you're saying something, then it's you're never going to get anywhere. And so many times I've seen projects fail because the one party thinks, oh, it went great, they didn't say anything, they didn't raise anything, but in actuality, sitting with community members, they're like, this went terribly and we'll never use that company again. And it's really sitting down to hear and giving people the space they need in order to share what they're thinking and feeling, and having the trust that they can share that with you, so that it's kept safe. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fair enough. So Ginger, how do you your education and professional background influences how you build and navigate relationships with communities?
So I totally agree with Jessica that it's all about relationships. But people don't want a relationship with us just to have a relationship. They want technical expertise, right? And so we certainly invest heavily in just going to see people and spend time in community. So all of the directors of our research firm have spent 20 years building strong relationships based in a good way of working. But people do come to us for our technical knowledge. And so, for example, we just have to listen well and break it down. So I'm going to use an example that's going to be familiar to my co-op student that's here today, which is right now she's breaking down a facility that is bringing in cobalt. So that our client doesn't have enough time currently to break down where the cobalt is coming from, what the potential impurities are in it, what the potential environmental impacts of it are, different ways to manage closure, different ways to consider the economics of that cobalt processing facility. And that's what we do, is we break it down. They give us the instruction, they tell us what they want to know, we build briefing notes, and then we go back in because they're busily negotiating an agreement with the proponent, and we break it down for them. And they ask the questions, we use our technical knowledge to try to understand the issues. And oftentimes we're even trying to change the projects, right? So in some cases, we're trying to find solutions that will reduce the impact on land and water, and sometimes completely change the project to protect particular areas. So from the perspective of relationship, it is all about relationships. Firelight's, our work is based on 25 years each for the directors of building strong relationships in community and knowing how to listen and take direction, and then conduct ourselves well and appropriately. And we do it with a lot of humor. We do it with humility. And actually, I've learned a lot about humility in the past, I would say the past 15 years, that we have to get it wrong and then stand up and say, I got it wrong, and apologize. And that's, I just wanted to close this question, Leanne, by saying that I find a lot of young students in the university, quite settler students in particular, very scared of their own shadows in working in communities. And I just want to encourage them. And it's because in part they've been taught relationship is important, which is good. But they've also been taught, and I think they're almost scared of going to community now because of how much we have emphasized in education the need to be respectful and thoughtful and kind. But I think that they have to also understand and hear the message that they need to get in there and provide their perspective, and not think that they're going to change the world with their work, but that they're going to be a part of the effort together. And that they need to be bold and then make mistakes and say, I'm sorry, and look for good mentors that can support you to do that.
Yeah. So just how do you start building relationships? Like Jessica says, you have to have your relationships there before you need it. You say, you know, people have relationships because you provide value to them, but like pretend I'm a third year engineering student or fourth year, I want to do a project on X. How do I even begin to build a relationship? And what is that? Like, what advice would you give me?
There's people around you in your class that are not like you. Who are they? What are their perspectives? What do they know? Where do they come from? So I always emphasize people need to be curious, and they need to start building their relationships themselves, and they need to be personal. They need to be personal friendships. My father tells me a story that always makes me so sad. So he's non-Indigenous as well, and he tells me a story about how lucky my generation is because we can have personal friendships with Indigenous people. In school, there were not Indigenous people because all of my father's friends who could have been his friends were in residential school. So he couldn't be friends with them because they had been stolen away. And he is so jealous of our generation's ability to have personal relationships. It starts there. It starts with the kid that's in your class. It starts with all of the people around you. And it's our personal relationships that we have to start with. And then we have to start with the how we behave in our corporations. We need change makers in corporations. We need people who understand their treaty responsibilities and grow up with that as a very strong commitment. And then we need to repair our relationship to the land. And from there, on that point, I would say that, and I just love the graphic that Jessica used in her introduction of Wokotowin, because it looks at our family relationships, our individual relationships, and our community relationships, and our relationship to the land. And we need to think about all of those relationships.
Yeah, wow, powerful, absolutely. Jessica, like how do you build relationships? I know that sounds pretty basic, but we can't take it for granted.
100%. And it's always funny when people ask this question, because for me, it's one of those things that is just instinctual. But when I think about if I were to break it down in a logical kind of checklisty kind of way, what are some of the things that I do? Number one, you have to be okay sharing about yourself, because if you don't share about yourself, the other person's not going to share about themselves. And so deciding what you're okay sharing and what you're not okay sharing. And I know this is different from my approach when I was a student, for sure, because I was incredibly introverted. I didn't say boo. I didn't tell anybody anything about me because I was extremely private. And that's for a number of reasons that I now understand because of intergenerational trauma and some of the childhood stuff that happened to me. But being okay sharing things about yourself creates that comfortable space. Just being out in the community. I know one of the parts that makes people freeze about being in community is that they are in the minority. And so going to places where you are in the minority and getting comfortable with that is so important. So Edmonton is very diverse in its population. Go to a part of town where settler folks are in the minority, where there's a lot of newcomers or a lot of different ethnic groups or high Indigenous population, and just walk around and just get used to that feeling of uncomfortableness. Just because you're in the minority does not mean you're not safe, right? And just coming face to face with some of those stereotypes. And then again, going out to the community. So being involved, communities are actually quite open to people coming in and being part of powwows or shopping at their stores or volunteering in their schools or taking part in community events because it's a hand extended out. And just being generous. I'm generous because I have the fortune of having a well-paid job. So I give charitably to a lot of local charities. I donate the stuff that I don't need to people who need it. And just being authentic and generous, not expecting anything back, starts building that trust. And then people will just start talking with you. And once they do, you just listen. I know when I go out and about in many of the communities, people will just come up to me. And I know it's a little different for me because I am Indigenous. The stories they share with me will be different than the stories they share with a settler. But even I remember just standing, waiting to get into chat with Chief and Council. And the lady cleaning the floors came up, and all I did was smile at her. And she talked with me for about half an hour and shared her whole residential school story, and shared about her daughter. And she just shared. And I just stood there and listened and thanked her when she was done, and wished her well, and kept in touch. And so next time I go, when I see her, I'll say, oh, you know, how's your children, or how's it going today? And then you start having a relationship, right? So it's not only listening, it's remembering the details as well, and being thoughtful when you follow up. And the other part that I always tell people as well is when you go out to community, plan to spend quality time. And I know that's something that is in a bit of a tension with the industry world today, where, you know, oh, I scheduled a meeting from 1 to 2, and I'm going to be there from 1 to 2. But in community, it's the quality time that's the most important. So plan for your meeting from 1 to 2, but plan for it to go actually 1 to 5 and set aside the whole afternoon, and just spend the time talking with people, because it's the quality time that means so much, and the follow through. There's been so much disappointment in community that it's just heartbreaking how much disappointment there are. People who come and then go, and a lot of people who promise things that never come to fruition. So be realistic in when you're setting expectations with community as well. If you have funding that will only bring you out there for 3 years, just say that from the beginning. Just say, you know, I'm going to do my best to work with you and be part of your community, but like, just be honest, because that sets the stage for trust. Yeah, I think the last thing I want to say around building community, I find there's 6 kind of elements that always help with building community. So one of them is ceremony and tradition. So being part of any ceremony or tradition. Food brings people together. Gifting, the idea of gifting is a huge thing in Indigenous communities. Whether you're gifting or receiving, the benefit is the same. Song and dance, so being part of powwows, being part of round dances, being part of Christmas parties and Christmas celebrations, that brings people together. And then of course, just bringing people together for celebration moments and grieving moments too, right? So.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for that fantastic advice for both of you. I just want to quickly, because we're kind of quickly running out of time, so about 3 minutes, getting back to this idea of impact benefit agreements. And that's kind of, again, it's the interaction between organizations and communities, and how you negotiate that. And we kind of focused on more the kind of the personal, but like in terms of expectations and kind of thinking about how do we go forward in a good way for future generations. Ginger, can you have any thoughts on how you would evaluate the success of a project with an impact benefit agreement component, and what does that look like? So in about 3 minutes, Ginger.
Sure. I'll keep it short. I mean, they're a form of relationship. An impact and benefit agreement is a relationship between a corporation and a community, and it's writing it down into a contract. So it's holding down the commitments that the parties have to each other. Sometimes I look at these agreements in a way that suggests that they're just Indigenous, just the mechanism for Indigenous society to catch up economically with non-Indigenous society, because municipalities have been built off the back of industry, and always unions and companies shut Indigenous communities out. So in the 90s, we started these contractual arrangements in order to ensure that benefits flowed and impacts were prevented or protected against. They're imperfect. They don't always work. There's lots of companies that negotiate them to the lowest common denominator. And then there's many good change makers out there that are trying to build strong and authentic relationships that are based in honesty with the Indigenous partners that are in that hold the accountability to the land that where the project is operating. So that's, I mean, how to evaluate their success. you ask the community, ultimately, is the community proud of the agreement they hold with a company? If they can't remember it because it hasn't been implemented and it's a piece of paper that sits in their office, then it's unlikely that it's successful.
Yeah, wonderful. Jessica, do you want to add anything on that in terms of impact benefit agreements?
Yeah, for sure. I just want to build off a couple things that Ginger said really quickly, that it's funny, just the worldview differences, because treaty is negotiated with the positive outcome of everyone benefiting. But it's funny that in the Western Eurocentric kind of world, contracts are built for getting ready for things to fail. So it's already built on a foundation that things are going to fail. And then how do we divvy things up when things fail, right? It's just funny, that worldview difference. But definitely I agree with measuring the success. If the community doesn't remember it or know about it, then that hasn't been a successful relationship. And I think it is important to acknowledge the relationship beyond the generic idea of land ownership to that of the intent of treaty, where treaty rights are still reserved for not only the land, but the water, the spirit, and the mineral nation, and all of that that's encompassed in the borders that are found by these contract agreements, because those aren't always written into the actual rights of the community. The treaty rights are different than what is captured on a federal level.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent point. Thank you. So any closing thoughts? Jessica, do you have any closing thoughts for all of this?
No, I just want to, again, just thank everyone for being part of this discussion. I know it's a kind of a different way to look at sustainability, but sustainability of communities and relationships is something that does need to be considered. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Jessica. Ginger, any closing thoughts on all the material we've covered here in the last however many minutes?
I just want to thank Jessica for sharing her thoughts with me and with everyone here. Jessica also did refer to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's review, which was an inquiry. I would encourage everyone here to really sit down with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, sit down with the calls to action from both of those commissions. And as Dr. Chief Wilton Littlechild encouraged me, I encourage you to find one that you can set yourself around and find personal and professional ways to commit yourself to it. I think, some of you are going to be the CEOs, some of you are going to be the leaders in the nations, some of you are going to be, each of you is going to find your way, and those are really well anchored, thoughtful practices that have been offered to us as a gift. Jessica spoke of gifts, and that's a gift that was given to us in Canada, is those two commissions in addition to our treaties. And so those gifts need to be honored with our time and our attention.
Wow, thank you. Again, inspiring and instructive. So really, really wonderful. Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over now to Allison for some promos on upcoming events and speakers. So again, thank you both to Jessica and Ginger. Absolutely fantastic. And yeah, maybe go forward in a good way. And to Allison now. Thank you, everyone.